always felt like, surely I can do more.
The philosophy.
And have been working full-time at effective altruist organizations for the past 5 years.
I started getting into pandemic preparedness, and now I'm doing a PhD developing some of the tools and expertise we will need in order to detect the next pandemic.
Thanks very much for those messages, and we also want to hear from you. How do you try to do good in the world? You can tweet us at 1A or send us an email, 1a@wamu.org. Well, I want to pick up on something in one of those messages. That is, the way that effective altruism can prepare us for or position us better for future pandemics. This has been a cause that you have cared about. You write in the book about how you had a dinner with Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland in 2017, and you were charged with or allowed to bring forward sort of one issue you thought demanded her attention. You said it was pandemic preparedness, and you were kind of laughed off as a result of that. Help us understand sort of how effective altruism can do that, can prepare us for a future pandemic, as we talk about sort of what that might be like if there's a more virulent pandemic or one that is partially or wholly engineered by humans.
Sure. I mean, yeah, you're right that there are two sorts of risks. Natural pandemics, which, as we've seen, can wreak enormous devastation across the world. But then even more scarily, engineered pandemics, where we already have the ability to upgrade the destructive properties of viruses. And scientists do this in labs around the world. That technology will only get more powerful and only more democratized over the coming years. So how can we prepare? Thankfully, there are a number of activities and things we can do. So early detection of such as monitoring wastewater, screening it for all DNA in the sample, and looking to see what are new viruses in there, and are they growing exponentially. Secondly is a form of lighting, low-wave lighting, that can be put into light bulbs and could safely sterilize a room while not harming humans at all. At the moment, that's still very expensive, but with technological investment, we could get that down. And if that were part of building codes all around the world, we could eradicate the possibility of the next pandemic while also eliminating most of the respiratory infections at the same time.
Well, McCaskill, you take on criticism of this philosophy in the book itself. You respond to some of it, and I'd love to ask you about some. Philosopher Emil P. Torres identifies as a former long-termist, but they write in the web magazine Aeon, they, quote, come to see this worldview as quite possibly the most dangerous secular belief system in the world today, end quote. They argue that long-termism values humanity over actual humans. It worries about hypothetical existential threats to civilization rather than actual ones happening right now. And I wonder how you respond to that. Chris, you touched upon it a few minutes ago, but this notion that it's somehow callous or cruel or not right, to put it even more bluntly, to focus more on the future than what's happening right now.
Yeah, I think unfortunately that author's just attacking a straw man, views that we in the community don't really hold, where the risks and the issues we're talking about, they will impact the present generation, and they'll impact future generations too. But I don't think it's this unintuitive or crazy moral view. If I say, do you care about your grandkids or great-grandkids, I think the morally intuitive or common sense view is to say yes. And similarly, if I say, look, there is serious risk that of like a third world war, something that could end civilization altogether, or even worse, potentially something that could cause a stable dystopian future, perhaps a perpetual totalitarian state. Isn't that something we should be really worrying about? I think the answer is I think it's quite intuitive that the answer is yes. You don't even really need to rely on any kind of really fancy philosophical reasoning to get to that conclusion.
Is the fault here that there's a tendency to see what you're proposing in a binary, and maybe what you're arguing is that you can focus on the future without ignoring or neglecting the present?
Of course, where, at the moment, what fraction of the world's resources do we spend concerned for future generations? And it's very small. Maybe it's 0.1% or 0.01%. And I'd like that to be more. I don't know how much more. Maybe it's 1%, maybe it's higher, I don't know. But it's definitely more, and that's going to come at, I think, very little sacrifice from the present generation.
I think a challenge, you'd acknowledge this as well, of this philosophy is just the unknown, not knowing how things will pan out or what variables will affect other variables as the future unfolds. How do you deal with that? Explain to listeners just sort of how you deal with the fact that as you plot all of this out and think about the future with such a long time horizon, there is so much that's just simply unknowable at this time.
Yeah, I think we should be very humble about what we can and can't predict about the long term. And I think that gives a few lessons. So one is just trying to give future generations as many options as possible, where if civilization collapses or humanity ends altogether, well, we've deprived future generations of any options at all. If there were some, stable totalitarian state, again, we just greatly narrowed the space of all possible futures that we could have. And so I'm really not arguing that we should have some very specific future utopia that we're trying to enact in a million years' time. Instead, it's just trying to avoid those worst case outcomes so that future generations can figure out, with much better information, hopefully, and greater reflection, what the best thing to do is for them and for future generations from their perspective.
Will, as we gather comments and questions from listeners, here's one from the chair of the philosophy department at Seton Hall University who sent us a message. Here's Travis Timmerman.
I am both deeply committed to the project of effective altruism and a friendly critic of it. I first became aware of effective altruism as an undergraduate after reading Peter Singer's work on global poverty and animal welfare. This prompted me to get involved in the movement even before it went by the name effective altruism.
Thank you for that message, Travis. And I know that you were inspired by Peter Singer's writings as well, specifically by a famous essay from 1972 called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. Perhaps you could just remind us sort of what the moral exercise Singer presents in that piece is and explain how it affected you and sort of shaped your vantage on philosophy.